The conference room smelled like new carpet and decisions that had already been made. I noticed that detail the moment I walked in. Not the faces around the table. I'd seen those faces for 11 years. Not the projection screen showing slides I hadn't been invited to prepare. It was the carpet. Fresh. Industrial charcoal grey, still carrying that synthetic chemical bite that means a renovation happened recently. Someone had decided that room needed to look different, and no one had told me. That's the kind of thing you notice when you've been somewhere long enough. The small changes they make before the big ones. My name is James Whitfield. I'm 54 years old, and on a Tuesday morning in October, I get down in a chair in a conference room at Orhun Defense Systems, the company I had built, from a 20-person shop in a converted warehouse in South Austin, into an $850 million Pentagon contractor. And I watched a 31-year-old man with a Wharton MBA open a folder with my name on it. Derek Calloway didn't look up when I sat down. That was the first thing. Not a cruelty, exactly. More like an announcement. The way a surgeon doesn't make small talk before an incision. Around the table, 14 people. Vice presidents, directors, the head of legal. People I had hired. People whose first day I remembered. People whose names I'd argued for when the board wanted to cut salaries. None of them looked at me either. They had been briefed. This was not a meeting. It was a staging. Derek closed the folder and finally looked up. "James," he said, "let's talk about organizational efficiency." He smelled like expensive cologne and the particular confidence of someone who has never been wrong about anything in a way that cost him personally. I want you to hold on to that moment. The new carpet, the closed folder, the 14 people looking at the table, because 11 days later I was sitting in the office of the Chief Technology Officer of Sentinel Aerospace, Orion's largest competitor, and she was sliding a term sheet across a glass desk. $750 million for a patent that Derek Calloway had fired me without ever knowing I still owned. I want to tell you exactly how that happened. Not the highlights, not the punchy version. The whole thing, because the whole thing is where the real story lives, and the real story is considerably more complicated than the headline. But first, I need to tell you something about myself. Something I'm not entirely proud of. Where are you right now? What time is it where you're listening from? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone, because what I'm about to describe took 11 years to build and 14 days to detonate. And I want to know how far this thing travels before Derek finds out the truth didn't stay buried in that conference room. There is a version of this story where I'm the obvious hero. I'm the engineer. He's the MBA. I built something real. He managed a spreadsheet about it. I have 27 years of hands-on aerospace and defense work. He has never debugged a navigation algorithm in his life. The story writes itself. I want to resist that version. Not because it's false. The broad strokes are accurate. But because the version where I'm simply the wronged expert and he's simply the incompetent usurper leaves out the parts that are harder to say out loud. I'll get to those. Let me tell you who I actually am. I grew up in Houston, second of 4 kids. Father worked maintenance at a refinery for 30 years. Not a man who talked much. But he had a quality I've spent my adult life trying to replicate. He understood exactly how things worked. Not in theory, in practice. You pointed at any piece of machinery and he could tell you where it would fail. Not because he'd read about it, because he'd fixed it in the dark, with wrong-sized tools under pressure, enough times that the failure pattern lived in his hands. I went to Texas A&M on a combination of scholarships and loans. Electrical engineering, graduated 1992, went straight into the Navy. 6 years. Chief Petty Officer on the USS Houston. I managed classified communication systems for the 7th Fleet. That experience, learning how encrypted data moves under real operational pressure in conditions where failure has a body count, became the foundation of everything I built later. After the Navy, I spent 6 years at Raytheon, then 4 at Northrop Grumman during the early autonomous drone expansion. Watched 3 companies fold during the defense budget contractions of 2013. Watched colleagues, brilliant people, get walked to their cars on a Tuesday and told not to come back Friday. That's where I learned the lesson that, years later, saved me. An engineer named Walt Pruitt, 22 years at the company, had written the core guidance algorithms for 2 of their most valuable platforms. Got laid off in the same wave as 40 others. 2 weeks later, I ran into him at a dive bar on South Lamar. He had a beer and a look I recognized, the particular blankness of a man who just discovered the institution he served. Didn't remember his name. "You know what I should have done," he said. Not to me specifically. To the air above his glass. I should have kept a copy of the keys. I bought him another beer, and I thought about that sentence for the next 3 years. When I joined Orion Defense Systems in 2013, they were a scrappy startup in a converted warehouse. 12 engineers, a dream of autonomous infrastructure inspection, power lines, oil pipelines, cell towers, and a founder, Martin Okafor, who was the rare combination of technically brilliant and operationally honest. He knew what he knew, and he knew what he didn't. I built their entire navigation platform from scratch, called it PathGuard. It took 4 years of late nights, 3 near disasters, 2 funding crunches where I deferred my own salary to keep the team intact, and 1 specific breakthrough. A predictive navigation engine that let drones anticipate obstacles instead of just reacting to them. That changed everything. By 2020, we had contracts with 17 utility companies across North America. By 2023, we were managing autonomous inspections for 60% of the major pipeline operators in the Gulf Coast. $850 million in annual contracts. All of it running on code I wrote. And I want to be precise about something. I did not do this alone. Marcus Rivera, my lead navigation engineer, recruited straight from Caltech, one of the best autonomous systems minds I've ever encountered. Spent 4 years learning things no university teaches. Diana Okafor, our operations director. 2 tours in Afghanistan managing drone operations under actual combat conditions. Ben Torres, quiet and precise, who had the instinct to catch the errors that would have crashed hardware into a power line. They were not employees. They were the people I was responsible for. That mattered more than anything else when October came. Derek Calloway arrived 14 months before he fired me. His uncle, Richard Calloway, ran Pinnacle Capital, the private equity firm that had led our Series B funding in 2019. When Richard's firm led a recapitalization round 18 months ago, Derek arrived with it. Appointed COO with a mandate to streamline operations and accelerate profitability. He had never managed engineers. His last position was running a logistics company that moved furniture. I want to be fair here, because fair is harder and more useful than contemptuous. Derek Calloway was not stupid. He was specifically, precisely, structurally incompetent in the domain he'd been handed authority over. And that is a very different thing from stupidity. It's actually more dangerous. A stupid person makes obvious mistakes. A person with Derek's profile makes sophisticated-sounding mistakes. He spoke the language of management fluently enough that people who didn't know the underlying technology couldn't identify when his analysis was nonsense. He was excellent at executive communication, reasonably skilled at financial modeling, and deeply skilled at something I've come to think of as strategic narrative control. The ability to define the terms of a conversation so that his conclusions sound inevitable, In every organization, this profile eventually collides with reality. The question is how much damage happens before it does. Here's what I now understand about why Derek moved the way he did. He was 31 years old. He had been handed a leadership position he didn't entirely understand. In a technical domain he couldn't independently evaluate, in a company where the most important person was someone who had been there 11 years and could build rings around him intellectually without trying. Derek could not win on merit. So he moved to control the definitions of merit. He wasn't evil. He was insecure in a way that had never been confronted by real consequences, and his uncle's money meant it never had to be. The first 6 months were friction, not catastrophe. He cancelled our advanced sensor R&D program, reduced my engineering budget by 30%, replaced 8 experienced drone engineers with contractors billing at half the rate. When I objected, and I did more than once in writing, I was labeled resistant to organizational change. The word legacy started appearing in his vocabulary. As in, we need to think about moving beyond legacy architecture. Pathguard is legacy at this point. We don't want to be dependent on legacy systems. He used that word about 11 years of work, about a navigation platform that was generating 80% of the company's revenue. I'm going to be honest, that word made me angrier than anything else he did, more than being fired, because it revealed the mechanism he was using. If Pathguard was legacy, then its creator was legacy. And legacy things don't need to be compensated, protected, or acknowledged. They just get replaced. What Derek never asked. And this is the specific failure at the center of everything that followed, was who actually owns the keys to what I'm calling legacy? He assumed the answer was the company. He was wrong about that. The cuts came in waves. First, the R&D program. Cancelled in the 3rd month. I understood this as a signal, not a budget decision. We weren't cancelling research. We were cancelling the future in favor of extracting value from the present. Private equity logic applied to a technical company that needed reinvestment to stay competitive. I filed an objection in writing. It went into a folder somewhere. Second, the staffing changes. 8 engineers, people I had recruited, trained, oriented around our specific architecture, replaced with contractors. The contractors were competent. They just didn't know Pathguard. That knowledge, built over years of late nights and field tests and failures, doesn't transfer on a Tuesday. Derek didn't understand that. When the contractors took 3 weeks to implement what my team would have done in 3 days, he called it a productivity calibration period. I stopped arguing. I started writing longer emails. Third, the performance review. This was the one that told me exactly what was coming. 6 months before the termination, Derek sat me down with an HR representative and a document titled Strategic Alignment Assessment. It was 8 pages. It documented every moment I had expressed resistance to organizational direction. My objections to the budget cuts, my concerns about the contractor transition, an email I'd sent to 2 board members, not Derek, raising questions about the vendor contract for our next-generation sensors. That email was in the document. He had characterized it as going around management, as a pattern of undermining leadership confidence. I sat across from him and read 8 pages that redefined every professional act I'd taken in the last 6 months as insubordination. That is a specific kind of disorientation. You understand the words. You recognize the events being described. But the events have been reassembled into a shape you don't recognize. I signed nothing. I asked for a copy. I got one. I went home that evening, sat at my kitchen table, and called Tom Whitaker. Tom had been my attorney since my Northrop Grumman days. He was the kind of lawyer who said very little in conversation and asked very precise questions. He'd structured the documents I'm going to tell you about in a moment. When I told him about the performance review, he was quiet for a beat. "James," he said, "when someone starts building a paper trail about you, they're planning to use it. The question is whether you have anything they don't know about." "Check the filing from 2021, I said. He already knew what I meant. Fourth, and finally, the termination. Tuesday morning in October. A new carpet, 14 people, a folder with my name on it. Derek looked up from the folder, said the words. "Effective immediately." I looked at the 14 faces around the table, not in anger, in recognition. These were people I'd hired, mentored, argued for, worked alongside, and every one of them had decided, in whatever private calculation they'd run, that staying quiet was the correct choice. I don't judge them for that. I understand it. People have mortgages, people have children, people have learned, often at great cost, that standing up in a room when the power structure is clearly aligned against someone rarely changes the outcome and often changes their own situation. I understand it, but I want to be honest. It was the loneliest moment of my professional life. I stood up, straightened my tie, said one word, "Appreciated," and walked out past all of them. That word was not sarcasm. I'll explain why later. But first, there are things I need to tell you about 2021 and about a filing that Derek Calloway never read. When Martin Okafor founded Orion in 2013, he had two qualities rare in startup founders. He was honest about what he didn't know, and he paid attention to the people around him. He's the reason the structure I'm about to describe exists. 2021, Orion went through a near-death experience. The defense budget contractions that had gutted other companies were hitting us. We were 3 months from missing payroll. Martin and I were in his office at 2 a.m. The two of us, 2 cold cups of coffee, the particular silence of a building that might not survive the week. He said something I've carried since. "James, the only thing worth protecting in this company is the work. Not the brand, not the office, not the investor relationships, the work. Everything else is replaceable. Make sure whatever happens, the work is protected." He meant it in a general sense. I took it literally. The next morning, I called Tom Whitaker. What Tom and I did over the following 6 weeks was legal, documented, board-approved, and entirely invisible to anyone who didn't read the fine print of a 43-page IP licensing framework that the board signed during a meeting they were too distracted by the funding crisis to fully absorb. Here is what we did. I restructured the core PathGuard patents into a separate entity, Whitfield Autonomous Technologies. My company, wholly owned by me. Orion received a perpetual license to use the technology, with one condition, buried in Section 9.4.3, that I need you to read carefully. In the event of involuntary termination of the lead architect without cause and absent execution of a formal 12-month transition protocol, all licensing rights revert to Whitfield Autonomous Technologies within 72 hours of formal notice of termination. Said reversion shall be automatic, shall not require further action by either party, and shall be binding upon all successors and assigns. Every board member signed it, including Richard Calloway, Derek's uncle. Derek never read it. He managed his company the way someone manages a spreadsheet. He knew the numbers on the cells, but not the formulas underneath them. I want to be honest about something. At the time I structured that agreement, I told myself it was protection. A safety net, something I would never actually need because Martin was a good man and the company would treat me right. That was partly true. It was also partly the insurance a man buys when Walt Pruitt's voice still lives in his head from that bar on South Lamar. You should have kept a copy of the keys. I had kept the keys. And Derek, in his certainty that old things needed to be swept away efficiently, had just handed me the door. I didn't go home after the termination. I drove to Rosie's Diner on South Lamar. Red vinyl booths, coffee so strong it was almost insubordinate. Waitresses who'd been there since Bush Sr., who filled your cup without asking and left you alone without performing warmth. Exactly the right place for what I needed to do, which was sit still for an hour and think without reacting. The phone was already vibrating. Slack messages from colleagues. Sorry to hear, Nate. Stay in touch. The kind of messages that mean, I saw what happened and I'm not willing to say so publicly, but I want you to know I was watching. HR had sent an exit survey link. I didn't touch any of it. I ordered coffee and a plate of eggs I didn't eat, and did what I do when a system goes down. I mapped the dependencies before I touched anything. What did Orion actually have? The contracts, the relationships, the hardware, the operational infrastructure, the brand. What did they not have? The core encryption keys, the navigation algorithms, the predictive modeling engine, the 2.1 million hours of flight data training, the proprietary machine learning framework, everything that made the contracts worth anything. All of that lived in Pathguard, and Pathguard was mine. For the next 72 hours, technically, unless they executed a transition protocol they didn't know they needed. They wouldn't execute it. Because no one in that building knew Section 9.4.3 existed. The lawyers who'd reviewed it were gone. 2 rounds of layoffs. The board members who'd signed it had forgotten they'd signed it. Martin Okafor had left 18 months earlier when the PE firm restructured the leadership. The institutional memory of that agreement was entirely inside my head. I paid Rosie in cash and went home. My wife Rachel was in the kitchen when I walked in. We've been married 26 years. She's a Georgetown-trained attorney. She took one look at me, not at my face, she was reading my posture, and said, "How bad is it? And how long have you been planning for it?" "It's manageable," I said, "and longer than I've admitted." She poured me a bourbon, sat down across from me and said, "Then tell me the whole plan." I did. All of it. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're going to need Tom tonight." I called Tom Whitaker at 8 p.m. He answered on the first ring. He'd been expecting the call since the performance review. "Section 9.4.3, I said. "I pulled it this afternoon." He said. "Clock's running. You have until approximately 4:15 p.m. Thursday. I need a formal reversion notice filed with the USPTO before then. Already drafted. I'll send it to you in an hour." This is the part where I need to say something I don't always want to say. Tom had built that clause for exactly this scenario. He hadn't done it because he thought Orion was a bad company in 2021. He'd done it because he understood that companies change, leadership changes, and agreements made in good faith between people who trust each other don't survive forever in institutions that have moved on to other priorities. I'd been fortunate enough to have someone in my corner who planned for the ending before the story was over. Not everyone has that. The next morning, I filed the reversion notice with the USPTO, a digital timestamp, a checkbox, a document that transferred ownership of patent number 9,847,291 back to Whitfield Autonomous Technologies, effective upon execution. I did not call Orion. I did not warn anyone. I did not contact their legal team. The building had thrown me out with a severance check and an exit survey. They would find out the way all companies find out about things they should have already known. Too late, in the middle of something else, at the worst possible moment. Which, as it happened, was a Wednesday morning at 10 a.m. in a conference room full of Pentagon officials. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to stop here, because there's a version of this story, the one most people want to tell and hear, where I'm completely right, where everything I did was justified, where the reversion clause and the filing and the subsequent sale were clean acts of self-protection that any reasonable person would applaud. And broadly, I think that's true. But I'm 54 years old, and I've been wrong about enough things to know that being broadly right doesn't mean being entirely without fault. Here's what I've had to sit with. When I built Section 9.4.3 into that agreement in 2021, I told Martin it was protection for both parties. That was true, but I didn't fully disclose the extent of control it gave me. I knew Martin was under extraordinary financial pressure. I knew the board was distracted. I knew the odds that anyone would read 43 pages of an IP licensing framework during a funding crisis were approximately zero. I used that knowledge. I want to be careful about what I'm saying. I didn't deceive anyone. Everything was legal. The board approved it. But there is a version of ethical behavior that sits above legal compliance, and in that version, I handed people a document they couldn't fully evaluate and relied on them not noticing. I also need to say something about my team. When the reversion triggered and PathGuard went into protected mode, when 23 companies suddenly had grounded drone fleets and locked operator consoles, the field crews who couldn't fly their drones didn't choose to be in Derek's firing line. Duke Energy line workers in the Carolinas, Trans-Canada pipeline crews in Alberta. They hadn't done anything wrong. They were sitting in trucks in a standoff between me and a CEO who'd fired me. And they were the ones absorbing the cost. I'd built, though, fail-safes to protect myself. I hadn't built them to protect them. Ben Torres's newborn was 3 weeks old when the crisis hit. Ben's name was being used in Derek's internal communications as a possible sabotage suspect. That's on Derek, yes. But the chaos that created the opening for that accusation? I put that chaos in motion. I'm not saying I was wrong to do what I did. I'm saying winning cleanly is a luxury not everyone gets, and I didn't win entirely cleanly. The outcome was just. The path had some collateral on it. That's the part the headline doesn't include. The demo was scheduled for Thursday, 10 days after my termination. The Department of Energy had a $200 million contract on the table. Gulf Coast pipeline inspection, the biggest deal in Orion's history. Representatives from the DOE, Chevron, ExxonMobil, 3 defense contractors. Derek had told the board this was going to be the announcement that changed Orion's trajectory. He had not told the board I'd been fired. He'd buried my departure in an org chart update, phrased as workforce optimization. And he had not, because he could not, explained to anyone that the platform he was about to demonstrate ran entirely on an IP structure that had, as of the previous Tuesday, reverted to its original owner. Marcus texted me from the demo site at 9:23 a.m. First drone launched, following pre-programmed route. Looking good so far. 9:31. Something's wrong. Navigation system just froze mid-flight. Drone went into emergency hover mode. Everyone's staring at screens. At 9:38, second drone won't initialize. Control interface showing, license authorization required. Contact Whitfield Autonomous Technologies. Derek just went pale. At 9:45, DOE representative is asking if Orion actually owns the technology they're demonstrating. Derek is stammering. At 10 o'clock, complete disaster. All 4 demo drones grounded. Chevron team is already leaving. DOE rep said something about due diligence concerns and walked out. I was sitting in my home office. Coffee going cold. Ranger, my German shepherd, asleep on the floor beside my chair. I read each text as it arrived and felt something I want to describe accurately. Not triumph, not satisfaction. A cold, quiet confirmation. The kind you feel when a system behaves exactly as designed, and you realize you understood the system correctly all along, and you wish you hadn't needed to find out this way, but you needed to find out. The crisis spread beyond the demo within hours. PathGuard wasn't just sitting on Orion's servers. It was actively managing autonomous operations for 23 companies across the country. When the license expired, those systems didn't crash. They grounded every drone and locked every console. Duke Energy's fall inspection schedule. Frozen. Hundreds of miles of transmission lines unflown. TransCanada escalated to their CEO. The Army Corps of Engineers raised questions about national infrastructure security. Derek spent the afternoon trying to contain the narrative. He told clients it was a cybersecurity incident. He put Marcus and 2 of his other senior engineers on administrative leave, pending investigation. He accused them of leaving back doors in the navigation code. Diana called me that evening. "He's blaming the team, James." I'd expected that. It was the only story that kept Derek alive internally. If there was sabotage, his decision to fire me could be reframed as the right call, and the saboteurs could absorb the damage. It was a desperate story, and it required destroying the reputations of people who had done nothing wrong. I sent one email that evening to Derek's legal team, not to Derek. It contained 3 attachments: the reversion clause, the USPTO confirmation of the patent transfer, and a formal licensing offer. The terms: $18 million upfront, 12% royalties annually on all revenue derived from PathGuard-dependent contracts, a board seat with voting rights, public acknowledgement of original authorship, and Derek Calloway's immediate resignation. The HR director called the next morning at 7. "James, we'd like to explore a consulting arrangement, perhaps a 60-day engagement." "Sandra," I said. "Derek Calloway fired me publicly in front of people I'd worked alongside for 11 years. He treated me like a broken copier he was sending back to the leasing company. You want me to fix his disaster for consulting fees?" She went quiet. "What would it take?" she finally asked. "You have my terms?" 3 days of silence, during which, at Orion's downtown headquarters, their legal team was apparently working through the night, discovering that every claim they thought they could make about ownership was structurally wrong. The agreement was airtight. Tom had spent 6 weeks making it airtight. Then, on day 4, my phone rang. A number I knew. Catherine Park. Catherine had been at Orion from 2014 to 2018, Chief Technology Officer before Derek's predecessor restructured leadership. She'd left, or been pushed, after she told the board directly in a meeting that their cost optimization strategy would destroy the company's competitive advantage in 5 years. She'd been right. She was now CTO at Sentinel Aerospace. "James," she said, "I've been watching. We want to talk." We met the next day at a seafood restaurant in Houston's energy corridor. She was direct in the way people are when they've spent years being right about things no one wanted to hear. She slid a term sheet across the table. $750 million. Full acquisition of the Whitfield Autonomous Technologies patent portfolio. Plus a 5-year CTO position at Sentinel, full authority over technical direction, budget control, team building, a lab that, she said, would make my Orion facility look like a garage. I looked at the number for a long moment, not at what it meant financially. Though I understood what it meant financially, I looked at it as a valuation, a formal, documented, board-approved assessment of what the work was worth. The work that Derek had called legacy, the work that had been generating 80% of his company's revenue while he was busy eliminating the people who built it. $750 million. That was the number Derek Calloway had optimized away. I called my team before I signed anything. Marcus, Diana, Ben Torres. I told them what was coming. I told them I wanted them with me. Sentinel was prepared to make competitive offers with signing bonuses to offset any non-compete concerns. Marcus didn't need to think about it. Neither did Diana. Ben, who had been on administrative leave, accused of sabotage, while his newborn daughter was 3 weeks old, said he'd need to see the health benefits first, and when I told him they were comprehensive, said yes. I signed the term sheet 11 days after I'd been walked out of that conference room. Derek Calloway called that evening. He sounded different from the man who'd opened my folder without looking up. "Hey, James, you can't do this. 300 people. "Derek," I said, "you had 11 years of those 300 people's work, and you handed them to someone who would use it correctly. They'll be fine. My uncle's fund is going to have a very interesting conversation with their limited partners about what happens when you fire the architect and keep the building." I want to tell you how Derek responded to the public news. He denied it, then blamed the engineering team, then blamed the legal team, then issued a statement about strategic partnership transitions in the autonomous systems market that managed to say nothing true in 400 words. His board went silent. His uncle's PE firm issued no comment. The company's stock dropped 47% before trading was halted. But I want to be honest. None of that felt like victory. It felt like watching something I'd spent 11 years building come apart. Yes, it was coming apart because of Derek's decisions. Yes, the technology was safer in Sentinel's hands. Yes, the team was coming with me. But Orion, the thing Martin Okafor had founded in a warehouse, the thing we'd built together before the money found us, was done. I had won. And something real was still gone. People ask me what $750 million feels like. I always pause before I answer, because the honest answer is not the answer they're looking for. It feels like being correctly valued for the first time. And then it feels like realizing being correctly valued at 54 doesn't give you back the years you spent being undervalued at 43, 47, 51. The math doesn't work that way. The money doesn't move backward. Rachel and I sat on our back porch the night the sale closed. Good bourbon. The particular quiet of a Texas evening that has finished performing. I kept waiting for the feeling I'd expected. The clean, completing sensation of a resolved equation. It didn't come. What came instead was something more complicated. I thought about Walt Pruitt and his glass of beer and his sentence about keeping copies of the keys. Walt had been right, but Walt had never gotten to keep his keys. He'd just gone home that night without the thing he'd built, and the lesson arrived too late to save him. I'd been lucky enough to hear the lesson in time to act on it. I thought about Martin Okafor, who'd said to protect the work above all else. Martin was running a small consulting firm now. He'd reached out after the news broke. We had lunch. He said, "I always thought you might have to use it. I hoped you wouldn't." I said I'd hoped so too. I thought about Ben Torres's daughter, who had been 3 weeks old when her father was publicly accused of sabotage by a man trying to survive a crisis of his own making. She's 5 months old now. Ben is our senior navigation architect at Sentinel. She'll never know that moment happened, but Ben knows, and I know. There are things the sale didn't fix. The years I spent managing down instead of building. The engineers I watched leave Orion during Derek's tenure because the culture had soured and they had other options. The meetings where I stayed quiet one time too many, trying to preserve a relationship that was already being dismantled around me. The fact that Marcus Rivera spent 2 weeks under a cloud of suspicion that he did nothing to deserve, and that I could have structured the reversion differently, with a 96-hour window instead of 72, with direct notification to Orion's legal team before the demo, in a way that protected my rights, without creating a crisis that pulled innocent people into its wake. I chose the 72-hour window. I chose not to notify them early. I chose to let the consequence arrive at maximum impact. I had reasons for those choices, good ones, but reasons are not the same as being without fault. Winning, in my experience, is rarely as clean as the headline. I want to say something directly to the people who heard this story and thought, that's not available to me, because it's not available to everyone. The legal structure I built required Tom Whitaker, who costs $400 an hour and whom I'd known for 15 years. It required a board that was distracted enough and trusting enough to approve 43 pages of IP agreements during a funding crisis. It required 11 years of institutional presence that gave me leverage at the exact moment the reversion triggered. It required being, specifically, the architect of the thing that couldn't function without me. Most people who get fired by someone younger and better connected don't have a Section 9.43. They have skills that aren't documented. Knowledge that lives in their hands and isn't in any patent filing. Years of institutional memory that aren't protectable because they were given freely and informally, the way good work often is. If you're that person, and most people are, I don't have a clean answer. What I have is this: Walt Pruitt's lesson, delivered to me in a bar in South Austin 20 years before I needed it, was about documentation and structure. Not because documentation is everything, but because undocumented value is invisible value. And invisible value gets cut first. Whatever you're building, write it down. Name it. Date it. If you can structure formal credit for it, do. Not out of distrust. Out of clarity. Clarity is what survives when everything else is being optimized. That's not justice. It's just the closest thing to protection that most people can actually access. Here's what the word appreciated actually meant. When Derek Calloway opened that folder in that conference room and said, "Effective immediately," I looked at the 14 faces around that table and I said one word because it was the only word that was true. I wasn't being sarcastic. I wasn't performing control. I was genuinely, specifically grateful. Not to Derek, to the moment. Because after 11 years of managing around the limitations of people who had authority over something they didn't understand, after years of translating my work into language that MBA frameworks could absorb, of filing objections that went into folders, of watching Walt Pruitt's story play out in slow motion around me. That moment in the conference room was the clearest thing that had happened in years. It removed the ambiguity. I knew exactly what I was dealing with. I knew exactly where I stood. I knew exactly what I was going to do. That kind of clarity is a gift, even when it arrives in ugly packaging. Martin Okafor told me to protect the work above all else. I'd spent 11 years doing that inside a building I didn't own. Derek Calloway, in his certainty that I was obsolete, handed me the chance to do it somewhere I did. Marcus Rivera is our VP of Navigation Systems at Sentinel now. He's 31 years old and building things that won't exist anywhere else on Earth for another 5 years. Diana Okafor runs field operations with the calm authority of someone who has managed actual life and death drone operations and finds corporate crises comparatively manageable. Ben Torres's daughter is 5 months old and already, according to Ben, showing an alarming interest in the mechanical structure of her crib. The DOE contract that Derek destroyed, the $200 million Gulf Coast pipeline inspection contract, Sentinel won it. Largest autonomous drone services contract in federal history. Orion Defense Systems filed for bankruptcy 14 months after I left. The assets: office furniture, a testing facility, 2 contracts that had already been renegotiated by the client, were sold to pay creditors. The 300 people Derek had invoked as a reason I shouldn't protect myself had mostly landed elsewhere by then. The good engineers, as they always do, found places that needed them. Derek Calloway is doing management consulting in Phoenix. I don't know if he thinks about that conference room. I don't spend time thinking about what he thinks. Here's what I think about. Martin Okafor at 2 a.m. in an office in a converted warehouse with 2 cold cups of coffee saying, "Protect the work." Walt Pruitt over a beer on South Lamar saying, "Keep a copy of the keys." And my father under a machine at the refinery in the dark with wrong-sized tools, running his hands along the thing that was about to fail until he felt exactly where it was going to go. I am my father's son. I know where things fail. I just learned, late and expensively, that the most important thing to understand is the failure mode of the system you're inside. And when you understand it, when you've documented it, named it, dated it, and built the structural protection that keeps your work yours even after you leave the building, you can walk out of a conference room in front of 14 silent people, past 14 years of carefully avoided consequences, and say one honest word. Appreciated, because you know what they don't know yet. There's just one more thing and I haven't told you. 3 months after the sale closed, I got a letter. Handwritten. From a junior engineer at Orion. Someone I'd never managed directly. Someone who'd been hired 18 months before the termination. She'd been at the demo. She'd watched the drones go down. She'd watched Derek try to spin the failure and blame the team. She'd left Orion the week after and was applying to graduate programs in autonomous systems. She wrote, "I didn't know what was happening in that conference room the day you left. I know now. I just wanted you to know that I'm going into this field because of the work you built, not the company that claimed it. I hope that matters to something." I wrote back. We're funding her fellowship at Sentinel's research program starting in the fall. That's the part Derek will never understand, and the reason his model always fails eventually. What he was optimizing was revenue. What he was destroying was the thing that generates it. The capacity of good people to do meaningful work in a place that sees them clearly. The work doesn't stay in the building when you fire the people who care about it. It goes with them. And if you've built the structure correctly, the work's ownership goes with them too. This story is not finished. The fellowship is just beginning. The platform we're building at Sentinel is 2 years from public deployment. Marcus is working on a predictive navigation breakthrough I can't discuss yet. And the question of why defense technology owes to the people who build it, as opposed to the financial structures that claim it, is a conversation that hasn't concluded. Real stories don't conclude. They just reach the point where you stop telling them for now. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. Tell me what you built that someone tried to call legacy. I want to know. I'll see you in the next one.